Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. We are going to look at two different sheikhs, two different scholar slash sheikh, knowledgeable ones of hadith books and what they term Sunnah. And our purpose of looking at this is to show you that between them, there is no agreed upon meaning of Sunnah that they call us to, as well as there are different methodologies of determining what hadith they have is acceptable or not, as well as we will see that one of them, particularly the first one that I will be showing, when he teaches, and I believe that there are other ones that do this, that when they teach, they put forward their own type of teaching as their own type of way towards the hadiths that they go by, and definition of Sunnah that they go by as being the only true way, or the true way. So when we look at this, we're going to see that what they call us to, those of us who follow the Quran alone, what they call us to is thing their own making in a way. Some questions that will be asked before I show this. I will ask the questions first, and then you can see the video, and I might ask the same questions afterwards. But if I don't say it afterwards, then just go to the beginning and listen to my questions. Here's some questions to them. Some of them, they take 5 principles or 5 conditions, they call it, and say this is the way towards a hadith to understand if the hadith is acceptable or not. And some of them take 8 principles towards a hadith and say that that is the method. And then the ones who go by the 5 principles usually will say that no, there is no other principles or 8 principles, that the scholars have come to an agreement, all their scholars have come to agreement that there's only 5, which can be responded by another scholar from a different method will say no, there is no agreement, there's differences. So here's my question before I show this. 1, what ayat tells us in the Quran? What verse in the Quran tells us? What ayat tells us? What ayat tells us which hadith books to go by in Deen? 2, what ayat tells us which principles towards the hadith books, whether it be 5 or whether it be 8, what ayat tells us or verse in the Quran tells us that Allah gave us that through His Prophet? Or even if you could show us from one of your hadiths these 5 principles that the Prophet handed you and said, use these principles to go towards my Sunnah or my hadith books. Really, the main question is, where in the Quran does it tell us which principles that Allah revealed and gave to us through the Quran and told us to use these principles towards the hadith books? Okay, so that's some of the questions. Okay, secondly, which hadith methodology? Question number 2, which hadith methodology did Allah give us through His Prophet? I believe I asked it in a different way, but we'll go ahead and take that. 3, which hadith principles did Allah give us? And I asked that already, so I'm just reiterating that. None of these hadith principles, I'm just making a statement, did He give us through the Quran. So these principles are a bid'ah and innovation to the deen itself, because they determine what your deen is. They determine what your religion becomes. Another question. Those of you who accept the ahad category of hadith, singular narrated, and those in the mutawatir, the question is this: are the ahad category hadith certainty, qati or not? I know that the muhaddithin group says, for the main part, they are certainty. From my understanding, that's what they say. And the Hanafi say no, they are not a certainty. They are probably, they are probable if they are accepted as authentic. So which one did Allah choose of these categories? Meaning, did Allah himself reveal in his book that this is an ahad category of hadith, or this is a mutawatir category of hadith? Or did even in your hadith books, did the Prophet himself tell you this is a ahad category of hadith, this is a mutawatir category of hadith? And if he did not, then why did you innovate into the deen or Islam to add these things that Allah neither in the Quran gave you, nor even in your hadith books the Prophet himself gave you? Okay, so we're going to go look at this, and they're going to show us the differences among themselves. The first one I will be playing is a guy who studies under the muhaddithin concept of going towards the hadith, and here's what he's going to say. And then the second guy that I'm going to show you goes by the Hanafi, older Hanafi version of going towards the hadith. And listen closely what they say about Sunnah or the rules towards hadith. Here we go.
What does that mean? A hadith that is sahih has to meet certain criteria. Now,
he says the hadith, according to his belief, the hadith has to meet certain criteria. He's going to give you 5 conditions, and then he's going to tell you that the scholars agree. The next scholar I'll show you, he's going to disagree. He's going to say basically there's not 5, that there's differences. Okay? So the point of me showing you is that you got to be careful even when these guys teach, because when they're teaching you, they are also their way, they will make their way seem as if that is the only way, or the most authentic way, or the true way. Okay? And if you are a person that didn't even know these differences, you would think that he's teaching you straight Islam instead of his interpretation of really Islam. Okay, continue.
Brothers may know, many of the ulama of hadith, the scholars of hadith, had different criteria.
The scholars had different criteria. Okay.
Very stringent criteria. They were mutashaddid, yani they were extremely stringent. Some were very lenient. They were mutasahil. They made everything very easily acceptable. And the majority, and many of them, and we know, and we've come to an agreement on who they are mu'tadilin, the ones who were i'tidal, in the middle. Even amongst them, some had, like Imam al-Bukhari, Imam Muslim, and others, had very strict criteria and additional criteria.
My question again, remember, what criteria did Allah give through his ayats? Or even in your hadith book, one hadith, did the Prophet sit down and give you the criterions towards interpreting his own hadith? Continue.
Amongst the other ulama, yani Abu Dawud and Tirmidhi, Ibn Majah, Nisai, Imam al-Bazzar, and al-Bayhaqi, and Ibn Abi Shayba, and Abdul Razak al-Sanani, Ahmad ibn Hanbal, and others, so many great scholars of hadith, al-Hakim, and Ibn Hibban, and others, they all had their own criteria.
All had own criteria. So again, Allah didn't give you the criteria? Even in your hadith books, the Prophet himself didn't give you the criteria? Instead, these people came and made up their own criterias. Oh, okay. Towards the hadith. Okay.
But the ulama of hadith came to a consensus about 5 criteria.
So the scholars of hadith, which is the muhaddithin, which is a certain other group, they came to an agreement there's only 5 principles towards a hadith. So that automatically lets you know that Allah must have not revealed it, and the Prophet himself, from the hadith books they go by, must have not gave them that, mapped it out for them, and gave it to them. Let's continue. Is this really Islam?
These became the base. 5 criteria became the base.
So these 5 criterions became the base for what you accept in Islam. Their version of Islam, the Hadithi type of Islam from the Muhadithin group of them. Yet when they teach you, you would think that that is exactly the only way to understand Islam is through that. And if a person like, let's say, a Quran alone or somebody like that tries to teach, they say you're ignorant.
That they all came to an agreement. Now, even if you meet these 5, you may not be acceptable to be in Al-Bukhari, because Al-Bukhari is a high standard. I'll give you an example.
Okay, let us go to the other scholars. So we seen that right there, right? Now let's see what this other sheikh says about the differences between these scholars. Remember, this person right here is a follower of the Muhadithin group. Okay? So let's see. Let's go over here.
Match with each other. So now let's try to revise the definition of Sunnah and Hadith according to all of them. Okay? So the first is Sunnah. The meaning of Sunnah in Arabic language, literal meaning.
Okay, let us go back. Let's go back. Let's hear this whole thing. Okay, here we go. We will see right here, he will speak about the differences of the meaning of Sunnah, and that there are actually different ways that they go towards a hadith to determine, and these are different groups, by the way, that determine what the meaning of Sunnah is, as well as what the definition or what style of or principles they are supposed to use to go towards a hadith to find out if it's authentic or not, and that they differ with each other over that.
Okay, so the last topic is the topic of the hadith. What we can say maybe usul of hadith. So what we're going to discuss is the main issues. For example, now we're having a problem of anyone finds hadith, so straight away, why you guys are not practicing this hadith? Okay, so anyone who just goes to the local shop, bookshop, any collection of hadith, he just buys it, opens, he finds something. Okay, guys, here is the hadith, authentic. Bukhari, Muslim, Nisapuri, Tabarani, whatever, authentic hadith, and you guys are not practicing. You're not accepted. So you guys are not the Sunnah of the Prophet. So it is, I would call this, it is such a flashing but such smelly statement. Weak but flashing statement. Okay. So it is a question that asked in 2 words. Okay, say there is hadith, why you are not acting upon it? But answer will take long-term, you can say, lecture. So which may take maybe up to 1 year. Okay, because there are many conditions of acting or non-acting upon hadith, accepting.
There's many conditions on acting and not accepting the hadith. Okay.
And non-accepting the hadith. Okay. So inshallah today we're going to talk about only some corners of this question. First of all, just to clarify one thing, we have something called usul al-fiqh. Usul al-fiqh is, you can say, it is a principles, collection of principles which we use to understand Quran. Okay, as well as it is the same collection of the principles which we use not only to understand hadith, but to accept and to reject hadith also. But what about the Quran? Non-rejectable, because it is mutawatir. Okay, so for example we have zahir, nas, haqiqa, majaz, metaphoric and literal meaning, and many other type of ways of understanding Quran. But in terms of hadith, it is the same exactly types, but on top of that, some extra principles and conditions to accept and not to accept the hadith. So that.
Okay, so there's principles to accept and not accept hadith. Here we go.
Second side, which is accepting and non-accepting hadith, called mustalahul hadith.
Mustalah hadith.
Science of hadith.
Science of hadith.
But what about the side of the usul fiqh, which helps us to understand the hadith? It is nothing to do with mustalahul hadith. Mustalahul hadith is only something related to the chain.
Okay.
Okay, as well as it is related to the text of the hadith in terms of comparing this text to the text of other narrators of the same hadith. Only that. But in terms of a meaning, the scholars of Mustalah al-Hadith, they do not have a right to speak about that thing. Now, again we say, as each single madhab, they do have their own way of understanding hadith.
Each madhab have their own way of understanding hadith. Okay.
So each single madhab, they have their own way of accepting and not accepting the hadith. Today we are going to explain just some of them. Okay, and unfortunately, recently we were doing some lectures on Hanafi Mustalah al-Hadith, okay, toward the north of England. So then some of the Maulanas actually ordered his students who are organizing our classes to stop that, saying that there is no such a thing as Hanafi Mustalah al-Hadith. I just call it, it's just heedlessness or ignorance. If they...
So you notice right here, one group told him, or one group told them, there's no such thing as this type of going towards the hadith. Go ahead.
Wouldn't be Hanafi Mustalah and Shafi'i Mustalah, they wouldn't be Hanafi Madhab and Shafi'i Madhab. Okay, because what makes this Hanafi and that Shafi'i, their way of accepting and not accepting the hadith. You understand? Yeah, so the most...
So the difference between the Shafi and the Hanafi is the different ways of going towards hadith, accepting and rejecting hadith. Okay.
Widespread Mustalah al-Hadith in our time is the Shafi'i Mustalah al-Hadith. Anyway, before we go to the topic, first of all, we need to understand the meaning of Hadith and Sunnah to distinguish between them. Okay? So we say Hadith and Sunnah has different meanings, because when you go to the Fuqaha, Sunnah and Hadith for them is different.
So one group, the Fuqaha, the scholars of Fuqaha, Hadith and Sunnah has different meaning for them than the other groups. Watch this. So which Hadith, which Sunnah we supposed to go to, you calling us to?
Then the Hadith and Sunnah of the Muhaddithin. Okay, as well as when you go to Faqih and Usuli will give you definition of Sunnah which will not match with the definition of Sunnah according to the Faqih. Okay, and then, so Hadith, a Muhaddith scholar has his own definition of Sunnah, as well as Hadith, as well as Faqih, as well as Usuli, as well as Mutakallim, the scholar of Ilm al-Kalam and Aqidah. All of them have their own way of explaining the meaning of Sunnah, and it does not match with all of them, they do not match with each other.
So all of the different groups have their own way of explaining the definition of the meaning of Sunnah, as well as they all have their own way of going towards the Hadith to determine what they will accept and what they will not accept of the Hadith. Do you hear that? So when they call you to Quran and Sunnah, brothers and sisters, which Sunnah are you calling me to? Your group Sunnah's understanding? That group Sunnah's understanding? The Fuqaha's understanding? Sunnah? The Muhaddithin's understanding of Sunnah? Which methodology of towards the Hadith, science of Hadith, Mustalah, or science of Hadith do you want me to use to go towards the Hadith to determine if the Hadith is authentic or not? What, the 5 principles or the 8 principles? Etc., etc., etc. Let's hear that again.
Of the Usul Fiqh, which helps us to understand the Hadith, it is nothing to do with Mustalah al-Hadith. Mustalah al-Hadith is only something related to the chain. Okay? As well as it is related to the text of the Hadith in terms of comparing this text to the text of other narrators of the same Hadith. Only that. But in terms of a meaning, the scholars of Mustalah al-Hadith, they do not have a right to speak about that thing.
Okay.
Now, again we say, as each single madhab, they do have their own way of understanding Hadith.
Their own way of understanding Hadith.
Madhab, they have their own way of accepting and not accepting the Hadith. Today we are going to explain just some of them. Okay, and unfortunately, recently we were doing some lectures on Hanafi Mustalah al-Hadith, okay, toward the north of England. So then some of the Maulanas actually ordered his students who are organizing our classes to stop that, saying that there is no such a thing as Hanafi Mustalah al-Hadith. I just call it, it's just heedlessness or ignorance. If they wouldn't be Hanafi Mustalah and Shafi'i Mustalah, they wouldn't be Hanafi Madhab and Shafi'i Madhab. Okay, because what makes this Hanafi and that Shafi'i, their way of accepting and not accepting the Hadith. You understand? Yeah, so the most widespread mustalah al-hadith in our time is the Shafi'i mustalah al-hadith. Anyway, we'll go to the topic. First of all, we need to understand the meaning of hadith and sunnah to distinguish between them. Okay, so we say hadith and sunnah has different meanings, because when you go to the fuqaha, sunnah and hadith for them is different than the hadith and sunnah of the muhaddithin. Okay, as well as when you go to faqih and usuli will give you definition of sunnah which will not match with the definition of sunnah according to the faqih. Okay, and then so muhaddith scholar has his own definition of sunnah as well as hadith, as well as faqih, as well as usuli, as well as mutakallim, the scholar of ilm al-kalam and aqidah. All of them have their own way of explaining the meaning of sunnah, and it does not match with all of them. They do not match with each other. So now let's try to revise.
So, when they call you to Quran and Sunnah, when they call you to Sunnah, again, they do not even agree among themselves to what exactly Sunnah is. And you would go to that? Let's see. Should I go to some of these studies? Let us go over here real quick. Let's see. Maybe I can add a little bit something. So right here, this is from a Mustalah or Science of Hadith book that I have, and I want you to see this. You see at the top right here it says the Muhaddithin, and I got something underlined real quick. But it says the Muhaddithin accept it without any conditions. Hold on, where's my okay, hold on. Excuse me. So let's see. Okay, this one talks about 8 conditions. Okay. Well, here's what we'll do, because I don't want to confuse the subject. I guess I'll do this in a second, so I'll just give you a little glimpse of this real quick. Here's the difference. Okay, so remember that one scholar said, that one sheikh said that all of the scholars of his group, you know, his hadith, muhaddithin, had agreed upon that there are, and you see that word muhaddithun, his group, they all agreed upon that there's 5 principles. I want you to read this quick. The 5 principles is called 5 conditions in this book. But I'll just read above the yellow line, and then I'll the highlighted is called types of opposing, okay? And what I mean is I'll read the part where it says 5 conditions, and then it goes to the Hanafis, okay? But listen to this. It says, as we have seen, there are many questionable narrations that meet these 5 conditions, okay, of going towards a hadith he's talking about, and so are unilaterally accepted. Then it says in the yellow line that I put, fortunately the Hanafis place a strong emphasis on these 8 sources of Islam and an ahad narration conflicting with any of, ahad means a single report, okay, that's been passed down, single hadith report that's been passed down. So any single hadith report, Qabl al-Ahad report, that's been passed down that goes against the 8 sources or 8 principles, sometimes it's put, or 8 conditions, sometimes it's put, is rejected according to this book. Okay, now some books will say 5 principles, and that will be the Muhaddithin books that say that. But in this one, it's 8. Okay, which that shows you there's a difference. But watch what I underline right here. Okay, fortunately, the Hanafis place a strong emphasis on these 8 sources of Islam and an ahad narration conflicting with an ahad or single report conflicting with any of these 8 conditions or principles is rejected. Listen to what it says. Unity and respect for scholars should not descend into rewriting history to ignore differing theories of knowledge, especially as today it is pretended, even by many Hanafis, that there is only one agreed upon hadith methodology, the Shafi'i and the Hanbali. As we have seen, there is an earlier Hanafi alternative that robustly disagrees with it and must be allowed to do so. My point is, my point in showing this is to highlight that when that one sheikh got up and he said that there's 5 conditions that the scholars have agreed upon, that is not true. And so that's what this book right here is pointing out, is that unity and respect for scholars should not descend into rewriting history, to ignore differing theories of knowledge, especially as it done as today it is pretended, even by many Hanafis, that there's only one agreed upon hadith method, meaning the Shafi and Hanbali. Because why did he say that? Because it is the Shafi group and the Hanbali group that determine that there's 5 conditions towards a hadith. But the earlier Hanafi group did not accept that. You see that? They go by 8 principles. And as we just saw in the videos, they have difference, okay? They have difference. Alright? So, when they call us to Sunnah, again, I'm going to ask my question before I go ahead and get out of here. Which hadith methodology did Allah reveal in His book and give us in the Quran towards these hadith books? Like, He revealed the ayat and said, these are the principles that we reveal onto you, so that, you know, you can go sift through the sayings of the Prophet in case there's deviation, right? Which principles did, even in your hadith books, in a hadith, did the Prophet so-called in your hadith say, these are 5 principles that I give you, or 8 principles that we give onto you, that I give to you to use to decipher within the Sunnah or the hadith? Doesn't exist. But I'm asking you that anyway. So, in actuality, this then becomes what you call in your lingo a bid'ah, an innovation. And also, which category of hadith? You guys divided the category of hadith into ahad categories and mutawatir hadith. Which category did Allah reveal for you to call the things of this so-called Sunnah, or what the Prophet said? Okay, so hope I gave you something to think about. I will be doing some more things on this, and the different terminologies that these guys have come up with, even within their own groups of naming the hadith categories. They even have differences among themselves on that. So I just wanted to point this out, so when you hear them call you to Sunnah, know this, that the Sunnah they're calling you to, they don't even have an agreed upon definition between themselves of what Sunnah is. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Alhamdulillah.